What is up, you guys? It is me, it is Monty, and today I am back again, once again, with the start of another video. Technically, this is editing Monty. So, in September, I filmed a not-so-recent reads where I wrapped up everything that I forgot to wrap up until the middle of September. And then, a couple days ago, at the end, I think it was literally October 31st, I filmed my October wrap-up because I had finished my reading for the month of October. And then, or might have been November 1st, because I think it was November 1st, because I was doing it on the day that I did Reading Friends with Erin on her Patreon. So that's what that was. Anyway, whatever the case is, whenever I filmed that, I filmed everything that I read in October, but there were 3 things that I read in the month of September that I never talked about because I read them after September 15th, which is when I filmed my... Anyway, so there were these 3 books in limbo, and I just felt really bad. And because I hadn't edited this yet, I decided that it was probably a good idea to include them in this video, so that's what we're going to do here. So, the first thing that wasn't included was Mr. Magic by Kirsten White. I gave this book 2 stars. So, Erin and I have been doing these cursed buddy reads all year long. Some of them have been more cursed than others. Mr. Magic wasn't so cursed. Like I said, I gave it 2 stars. It was okay. Here, you would think this book is right up my alley. When I saw the premise of this, I didn't give a fuck what people said about Hyde. Okay, I said, y'all, Hyde might be a horrible, horrible book, but Mr. Magic is going to be for me. Okay, it's going to be for the girlies that get it, and I'm going to be the girlie that get it. And girl, I did not get it. So we are following this cast of characters from this early aughts, late 90s show, Mr. Magic. And I say early aughts, late 90s, but really this has been like a radio drama since radio began. And so this has been a very long running program. And it was filmed in the Utah desert. And honestly, it just wasn't very good. And the issue really was that it didn't have any of the hallmarks of like the good, cast coming back together. There was a reason like one of the cast members didn't remember anything. And then the supernatural, the spooky elements of this book just didn't quite fit together. And the people are saying that it's like an allegory for Kirsten White leaving the Mormon church. And like, I kind of get it. Like, I think that all the pieces are there. And ultimately what I discovered is that this story just didn't work for me. I do think that like it hasn't worked for anybody. When I rated it 2 stars, it was already getting like actual hate from readers. And I didn't hate it. I felt like all the pieces were there for me to kind of put something together, but I just wasn't interested in putting it together. And so like it was okay, it was serviceable. It hasn't scared me off Kirsten White, but she would have to put out another synopsis like Mr. Magic in a world that I was already interested in reading from for me to pick it up. So that's where I read that. Then I had When We Were Bright and Beautiful by Jillian Medoff, and I had seen Kenya read this earlier in the year, and so like Kenya reads a book and she rates it highly, it automatically goes into a pile of possibilities for me because I know that I too might read it and rate it highly. And here we are following this well-to-do family in New York City, and they are they're messy boots. Anyway, so we have this family, and one of their sons has been accused of sexually assaulting their their girlfriend, their ex-girlfriend, because they're supposedly have like broken up, and she's been stalking him, all kinds of like crazy shenanigan behavior. Honestly, I think that When We Were Bright and Beautiful and the most recent book I read, The List, which we get into at the end of this video, kind of, sort of. I do ultimately just say to go watch my Patreon video, but pay a little $3. There's 30 videos over there from last month. You will get your $3 worth. But When We Were Bright and Beautiful, I think, does an exploration of like what this man is accused of. The family obviously coming to his defense because they're horrible people, but it really makes you think. And ultimately, I found that this was a really well done book, and I gave it 4 stars, and it kind of ate, and I was kind of gagged at how horrible these people were. But again, I think that The List and When We Were Bright and Beautiful, they're not really doing the same exact thing, but I do think that they both take a story about a man accused of something and seeing people around him wanting to support him, or in the case of We Were Bright and Beautiful, fully supporting him. But the execution of both of those books is wildly different, and one of those executions is good, When We Were Bright and Beautiful. So I do recommend that you read it. And then the last book I read in September was Valley Verified, and I gave this 2 stars because I was being very generous, but this is just not a good book. It's by Kyla Zhao. It comes out next year. People already don't like the Fraud Squad as much as I enjoyed the Fraud Squad. Like, to me, the Fraud Squad was like fun and light, and I just had like a really fun time reading it. Valley Verified, we're following this woman who was a New York City like fashion reporter, transported into Silicon Valley. She was working at this tech startup as the VP of marketing, and it just didn't work. It's allegedly Devil Wears Prada means Legally Blonde, and I feel like that's that's already set up that doesn't quite work. I feel like the Devil Wears Prada just doesn't really materialize. It really is more like Legally Blonde-esque, like some of the similar plot beats. But seeing this woman trying to be a marketing person, trying to get this, trying to help up this tech startup when her only, it just didn't, I don't know. I do think that, skills are cross compatible and you can do whatever, you need to do to get the job done. But our main character here, I just felt like she had really good ideas. But the team, like, something about this book, it just didn't click. And by the end of the book, when we were getting into the Legally Blonde of it all and the Professor Callahan situation, it just didn't work. Okay, I'm sorry. I never really felt that Kyla Zhao was already, the world's strongest writer. But here it was a disappointment. It just was. Okay, I'm sorry. It just was not very good. Wasn't my favorite. So yeah, that's that on that. It's not the world's best review, but please just don't read that book. It's not that it's horrible. It's just that the characters, the romance, none of it really clicked for me. So I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you more. I have a Goodreads review. Maybe I'll leave a link down below. My Goodreads profile is always linked down below, so you could have got information on a bunch of these books and my thoughts on them before this video ever came out. So I guess if you want the cheat code, there it is. But for now, I'm going to hand back to Other Monty, and he's going to finish wrapping up everything that he read in October for you. I read things. I read like 14, 15 books in the month of October. Some of these were Spookopoly prompted. Some of these were not. They were just things that I felt were seasonally appropriate. And everything was documented over on my Patreon. I feel like I've been shilling the Patreon every time I come over here. But yes, it is a thing that exists. We do. I will say that it is not like everyone else's. Like, I'm not out here on Discord being best friends with you. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing fun little readathons, fun little, like, let's get together. I'm not doing those things, but I do, roughly every other month. Technically in December, I should be daily vlogging for them. I'm going to be daily vlogging for the people, be out here in public. I know, who would have guessed, me making public facing content. But every other month they get daily vlogs, they get weekly reading sprints, they get a weekly podcasty moment where I talk about things that I'm reading, and the TV and stuff that I'm watching, thoughts on general life, complaining about my workplace. So like, it is slightly parasocial in that way. And then they also get to vote on a book that is included in a weekly reading vlog it's a weekly reading vlog for the months that I'm not daily vlogging. So like November, I'm not daily vlogging in November. So they have a poll up. It's up over there. It's like nonfiction November themed at the moment. And so whatever wins the poll will be included in whatever I read in the second week of November, because I put up the poll a little bit late. So the second week of November, I'm going to be vlogging. They'll get the video in the third week of November. So that's how that works. It is what it is. It's a fun time over there, I think. That's where a lot of my energy has been at this year. And so that's why I'm not over here. But let's get to it, shall we? So the first book I read was actually Spookopoly related. So I rolled. The first thing I got was shortest book on my TBR. I don't own too many short books. I like to think that I own averagely sized books. So I had to go to my Libro FM collection, where I picked up Lauren Graham's Have I Told You This Already? Stories I Don't Want to Forget to Remember. I didn't rate this because I feel like this was an addendum to their first book, which I think was called Talking Too Fast. Don't quote me on that. But this just felt like stories that could have been in that book that would have been better received if it was included in that book, or if you had already read that book and you were just like, man, I really wish Lauren Graham would talk to me some more. So this is like a 4-hour-ish audiobook, and I listened to it literally on the bus ride home one day. And again, it's not like a bad story collection or an essay, but I just feel like because it was so short, if there wasn't the intentionality behind the, like, even like a regular, I read like an essay collection more than a memoir, and I went into it thinking it was going to be a memoir, but then it was a series of essays or just like little vignette moments that weren't bound by anything other than it felt like material that could have been in the book that already got published that was I think actually full length ish. So again, it wasn't bad, just wasn't very good. So then I read Under the Influence by Noel Crooks. This was also prompted by this Bookopoly board. After I was rolling as I go, so this was not very structured. But the second roll was Green on the Cover, and this was my Green on the Cover selection, kind of. There's another book that we'll talk about in a second that was also my Green on the Cover selection. It was kind of like whatever I finished first. But Under the Influence by Noel Crooks felt like a book that was meant for me. So here we're following a woman who is in New York. She is kind of living her nightmare, honestly. After graduation, she really wanted to get into publishing, and she got this job at a publishing house. And I think at the beginning of this book, she has been let go. And so she's no longer going to be working in the field that is her dream, her like what she really wants to do. And she's with her bestie, who is from a well-to-do family. And they're kind of like hanging out because they live together, but also prompting like job hunting, sort of. And her bestie comes across this job listing for this well-to-do influencer person who's just looking for an assistant. And so her bestie is like, you should just put in your application. Like, what's the worst that could happen? Like, just attach your resume, get it over with. And our main character, whose name is already eluded me, so one second as I read Harper. So Harper, who is also, I think it should be noted, is a Filipino character. So love that for the representation, girlies. So Harper decides that she's going to do it. She's going to send it in. And the next day she is woken up frantically by this influencer's other assistant calling her like, what are you doing? Like, we need you like right away. And so even though everything is a red flag from jump, Harper agrees to do this. She then finds out that the job is not in New York City where she is located, but she has to relocate to Nashville. And that's what she's doing at the moment. So she moves to Nashville on a whim to work in this woman's company. And again, like, it was just a series of red flags that was a little bit too unserious for me. Like, it was supposed to be a comment and a critique, and it was lightly influenced by The Devil Wears Prada, which I will say at least actually felt like I was reading something that was related to The Devil Wears Prada, because in the month of September, I read Valley Verified by Kyla Zhao, which is coming out next year. That was also loosely inspired by The Devil Wears Prada, and I would not mention that to anybody because I don't think that's very accurate, but I digress. And so here, at least, I could see the inspiration. Her boss is very demanding. It is very manipulative. It's not a very healthy place for her to be. But to me, it just felt like our character, Harper, was too naive, and there were so many red flags that I was like, for this to be set in 2023, just, it didn't feel accurate. Like, if this was taking place in like the mid 2010s at like the peak of the girl boss, it could really work. But I feel like in 2023, in the year of like everybody on like every streaming platform having like 36 scammer documentaries, for Harper to be this silly was, again, too unserious for me personally. I gave that book 3 out of 5 stars just because it wasn't my wheelhouse and it's not the worst thing I've ever read. So like maybe 3 is generous. But that's just what I gave it. The next book I read I was excited to read. It was an arc of Rosie Dannon's Do Your Worst, which is out like next week, I want to say, like the 11th, which might not actually be next week. So today's only the 1st. But whenever this book comes out, I do think you should purchase it. I do think you should read it. It is very good. Here we are following a woman whose name has also eluded me. Okay, so Riley is from America, and she comes from a long line of curse breakers. And Clark comes from a long line of archaeologists, and they cross paths in Scotland at this haunted house. They meet before they are aware that they're going to be working together, and it's a situation where they kind of like hook up, and then they realize that they're going to be working together, and they have to like figure everything out. And this is just a fun romance. It was fun. I do think this is like, there's something happening in publishing romances that I feel like they're coming out at the wrong time. Like, we had Wildfire, you know, the summer camp romance coming out in the fall. Then we have this book coming out after Halloween. Even though it's not like spooky vibes, we're dealing with a person who thinks she can break curses, and the castle is haunted, and it's kind of like Scooby-Doo. Okay, it's giving like Scooby-Doo, but there isn't like somebody at the end of the book that they're pulling a mask off. But I feel like that's kind of like the level of haunting that is happening, even though, again, there's no person in a mask at the end of it. But it was kind of giving Scooby-Doo vibes. So it was like Perfect for Halloween was coming out 2 weeks after Halloween, and then Bride is coming out in the middle of the winter, even though it's also paranormal. It's a lot of weirdness happening in publishing. Also, you have the fake Black romance coming out in Black History Month the next year. Publishing needs to get their shit together. Look at the schedule, like move some shit around. But This was a fun read. I had a really good time. I liked Riley and Clark's dynamic. I liked being in Clark's perspective some of the time. I didn't like this nearly as much as the intimacy experiment. I felt that those characters like really just hooked into me, and I was just gagged at how much I was invested in this rabbi getting together with this sex expert person. But this was fun. It was also fun. It was again kind of like an opposites kind of a track. They're like butting heads a little bit. They're forced to work together. He is like not entirely convinced that the place is haunted, and he's just like, I just want to be able. This is the other concern I had, is that I feel like Clark, our archaeologist man, he had like an entire separate storyline going on with his family and trying to like fix his name after some things that had happened. And Riley kind of had a similar situation with her mother where they were slightly estranged, like not to the degree that Clark was from his family, for reasons the book gets into. I just felt like Clark had a side plot that wasn't about this romance, and I felt like Riley didn't, even though she was, again, trying to break the curse and allegedly, sort of, but I just feel like his had a little bit more weight to it. So it wasn't equally balanced, but it was still a good time. This was, Do Your Worst was the other selection I had for green on the cover, because I was just, convinced that there was some green, some slight green. Then I read Lore Limpus Volume 5. This was a fun time. I like it. I like the storytelling. I like the art. I just like it, okay? It's like, it's a popcorn read for me. I don't think too much when I'm reading it. I just enjoy it, and then when it's over, and I look forward to the next installment, because that's just how I choose to consume that. Then I read Rouge by Mona Awad, and this was kind of like the first actually bad book of the bunch that I read this month. So Rouge, I thought, was going to be similar to Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Wang, which I read earlier in the year. And everybody had been telling me that Rouge was going to be a book that kind of critiqued the beauty industry in some kind of way, intergenerationally, because we're following a woman and her mother, and her mother is passing away, and like she is becoming invested in the ways of beauty that her mother was. And honestly, that's not what this book is. This book is for all the biracial girlies who wanted to be pretty like their white mommies. And honestly, I'm sorry, I just can't relate to it. Like, there's something about a biracial struggle book where the struggle is, I want to be white and I'm just not white enough and I'm not brown enough, that I personally just don't connect with. Every time I have to like see people on the internet talk about how they grew up biracial and they just couldn't pick a side and no one ever wanted them on either side, I just don't know where these people were living. I just cannot simply relate to the way that these people moved through the world. Like, I'm sorry. And so here I just felt like I did not care about this woman who spent so much of this book really confused about her biracial identity and just wanting to be like as white as possible. Like, I get it. I understand that like beauty standards push that. I understand that colorism exists. I'm not arguing that. I just feel like the book itself didn't really link like external pressures to the internal situation that was happening in this it wasn't good, in my opinion. I just feel like I talk about it. This was also the book that the patrons voted on, so they actually got like a whole video about this one. And after reading this, I just also came to the conclusion that Mona Awad is just not a very good writer. And so if this is, and I also, here's the other thing about this book. I do think that this was a deeply personal book for Mona to write, and maybe that is me projecting. Because at first I was reading this book and I was a little concerned because to my knowledge, Mona Awad was just like some random white lady. And so I Googled it just to be like, is she a random white lady? Just for context. And I found out that she is not a random white lady. Her father, I believe, is also Egyptian, which is kind of the character in the book. Her father is also Egyptian. Although at first we don't know he's Egyptian. He's just like randomly swarthy. And that could be anything. Doesn't mean a goddamn thing. But eventually we do settle on the fact that he is Egyptian. And so that combined with, some other things, I was like, maybe this is just a deeply personal text to Mona Awad. And, I love that for them. I love that this is their truth and their reality. But at the end of the day, for me, I just felt like the connection between the beauty industry and the way that this character was feeling and the way that she was growing up and the things that was happening around her, all of it just felt like very disparate. And I don't feel like there was anything connecting it. And so it's just intellectually, I understand the connections, and intellectually, I understand the point being made. But at the end of the day, it really just felt like a book where I was reading this woman who wanted to be pretty like her white mommy, but she wasn't pretty like her white mommy. And her white mommy wasn't even like, I don't know, like sometimes you read or you hear about people who are biracial who have just like really racist mothers. And there were some racist vibes kind of from this woman in this book, but we also didn't spend enough time with her to like really suss it out. It was just like two conversations we really kind of, it's a little weird. It's a little unnecessary. There's also some like wicked stepmother Snow White vibes going on there, which doesn't even make any sense, but it's just not very good in my opinion. And if this is what Mona Awad is doing when the storytelling is competent, I really don't want to read one of the books where it's just like weird and vibes, because I don't know. I do think that if you liked the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, you would like this book. They're not similar in terms of messaging or themes or anything, but I do feel like a similar audience would appreciate the failures of both books. Then I read The Golden Gate by Amy Chua. This was not a good book. I gave this book 2 stars because I thought that at least it was trying to do something. But here we're following, I think his name is Al Sullivan, and he was a Mexican-American detective in San Francisco. And at the beginning of the book, we find out that this former presidential candidate has died at this hotel. And we spend the whole book kind of knowing what family is responsible for this. And so it's not so much of it like who done it, but which person in this family did it. And I get how that sounds like a distinction without a difference, but it is there. So like we do see some investigating happening, but also I feel like Amy was just very intent on including every historical fact about Northern California at this particular period of time, like the 1940s ish, that she could. And so while I appreciated the historical asides, I do think that they drag down the narrative quite a bit. And oftentimes it didn't even feel like I was reading a novel. It kind of felt like I was reading the footnotes, and then there just happened to be a narrative playing along in the background. More like it was reversed. Like the bulk of the book was the footnotes, and the narrative was where the footnotes would be. It was kind of weird. But again, like I appreciated the historicity. I think that's the proper use of the word, if it's even a word. Like I appreciated it in my historical novel, but also I just felt like it wasn't really going anywhere. I also thought that the idea that Al Sullivan was going to be this Mexican-American character was an interesting choice. I understand like why you would want to do some of that, but it just, I don't know. I do think that, I don't know. I didn't like it. Like as much as it added to the story and it, added this other layer of, historical relevance, like what we could talk about because he was a Mexican-American person who was kind of passing for a white man, and how I think it was his niece couldn't necessarily, it added layer and depth and nuance of the story that is appreciated, but I just ultimately felt like it was a weird choice to make. Then I listened to Julia Fox's memoir, Down the Drain, just because I could. I don't know what I was doing one day, but I saw that she was coming out with the memoir, and I was like, I'm going to read that memoir. And so I had it on hold, and then the hold came in, and that was the end of the story. But she narrates it herself. And in my daily vlogs talking about this, I kind of felt like there was a lot of storytelling happening. And I felt like I learned a lot, but I wasn't necessarily certain that there was the level of reflection that I would like in a memoir. Like as much as it's interesting for you to bring me into the way that you grew up and your upbringing and your life before you were the person that I know you as, at a certain point, it just kind of felt like I do think that alongside that, I would like some reflection and some introspection and some, meditation even on why that these stories in particular are so, you think, important to the person that you are today, and how those not only shaped you, but like, would you change those things? What is there to gain from those things? And there was just a point in the narrative where I didn't care anymore, which is horrible because Julia Fox has gone through so much. A lot of the memoir details her very abusive relationship in her youth era, like right into early adulthood. Like she's like 16, 17 years old in this very abusive relationship, like locked in her boyfriend's apartment with his mom. It's weird. It's a very weird time. And then after that, there's a lot of like chronicles of drug use. And I don't know. It was also the first time of a couple of things in this over the course of the month that I read, where I just felt like white poverty was very different to a kind of poverty that I could imagine. Not to say that Julia Fox wasn't poor or anything, because she does detail being homeless and like living, and just, again, some really horrible situations. But again, like white poverty still just felt like very different than the kind of poverty that I imagined. And, maybe that's on me for, stereotyping the people. I will fully accept that. But again, I didn't love this, and so I didn't rate it, because I'm not going to be out here saying, oh, your life is horrible 1 star. Like, no, it just wasn't 5 stars for me. And so if it wasn't 5 stars, I feel like it's not even worth rating it on Goodreads. But I do think it's worth a listen. I do think it's worth a read, particularly if you are interested in Julia Fox, or even if you're not interested in Julia Fox and you just want to be, I don't want to say be nosy, because I do think that while she shares a lot, there comes a point where when she's finally into the fame era, the names go away. Or I mean, let me not say the names go away, but everyone was getting like fake names in her past, which I think that's fine. I don't really care. But then when it was in the fame era, it was just like descriptors, the boyfriend, this person. And it's just like, okay, you could come up with a fake name, maybe. But also, I feel like it's a little bit silly when you're talking about Kanye and you just won't put fucking Kanye's name in the book. But that's just me. Then I read Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism by Rachel Maddow, because last year Rachel had 2 books on my favorites of the year list. She had Drift, which I think is still, particularly today, with all that's happening in the world, an important text to kind of contextualize the American military. So Drift, 5 out of 5 stars forever. And then Blowout, which again, with all that is still happening over in Ukraine, an excellent read. And that's about Russia and the oil industry at large, and how the two are dependent on one another. It's just read the book, just read it. But Fascism, or Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism, is similar to the podcast she put out, I want to say last year, Ultra, where it talks about the 1930s, late 1920s, into the 40s situation, like leading into World War II, about the domestic rise in fascist plots to overthrow the United States government and the various people that were part of that. So while this is an extension of the podcast, and so towards the end of the book, I feel like it's more of a retread, but at the beginning of the book, there is far more threads connected to that later plot to overthrow the government. So we talk about Henry Ford more. We talk about how he really laid foundation for all these other groups and people. We get more on Father Coughlin. It's just an excellent listen. I am biased because I already had listened to the podcast, but I do think that even if you hadn't, this would make sense and you'd get a full picture of this not so much talked about period in American history. Then I read Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare, which I have a whole video for you guys, the public, to watch. So I'm not going to talk about it here, but didn't like it. 1 star. I didn't even rate it on Goodreads, allegedly, so maybe 1 star is even generous. Then I read The Majority by Elizabeth L. Silver, which was a thinly veiled life story adjacent kind of fictionalization of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but here it's Sylvia Olin Brand. Sorry, Sylvia. But she is also a Jewish American woman from New York, and we chronicle her life and her journey to the Supreme Court. I was really, really invested in this book. I was really excited for it when I saw it on the new release shelf. I'd never seen any, marketing for this book, but I was excited to read it. And then I read it and I gave it 2 stars because I feel like it just wasn't very good. It's told in distinct chunks of this person's life instead of like a full narrative. Like, we don't really see them growing into a lawyer, becoming a Supreme Court justice. What happens is at the beginning of the book, Sylvia is dead. And everyone is kind of split. Again, it's very much Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Like, should she have stepped down earlier, or, should she have continued to fight what she was doing in the moment? And so after she passes, what is discovered in her desk is what we are reading as the reader. So she has typed up her life story, which is how I know it wasn't going to be very good. And we are then reading that. And so we see her as a little girl when her cousin comes from post-World War II Germany. Her twin sister had died in a concentration camp, and she is, coming to stay with her distant relatives, Sylvia. And so we see them growing up, and it's really her cousin who kind of ignites this initial interest in the law, because her cousin's parents were lawyers in Poland before the Nazis invaded. And so her cousin is talking about how, the laws protect us and like the law is important, and she goes and watches these trials in New York City, even though she doesn't really speak fluent English, or she has like some troubles with English, or maybe I'm just making the entire thing up, but she does go and watch these trials. And so that's kind of like Sylvia's initial pathway in. And then we see her a little bit after that, still as a girl in New York, kind of coming into her own, speaking up for herself. Then we leave that behind and we follow her to Harvard Law, where she's one of the first class of women admitted to Harvard Law. It's just her and 8 other women. We see her bonding with this black woman who is also her roommate, and they live off campus together because the dorms aren't co-ed yet, or whatever the reason is. And so we see that friendship forming that's going to come into play later, and they have this lasting relationship because then this black woman has to drop out, and she goes and becomes a journalist that is revered later on. And so there's a lot of that, but it's just very distinct chunks of time that we see her. And I feel like this book should have been a lot longer. I feel like it would have been better if we were actually getting a full picture of her life and not just these very key moments. We don't really ever see her becoming a justice. Like, we don't really see her as a justice because she's dead. We see her kind of in this the confirmation hearings. It's just, I don't know. I feel like it was... in some ways, I felt like Silver was too nervous to actually write a book that would fictionalize Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life and have kind of the same pushback that people did about Rodham. But I feel like at the same time, she didn't go far enough to really fictionalize this person to distance them from Ruth. And so, I don't know, there's something about it that just didn't quite work for me. So that's everything that I have marked as actually read. So now I need to go to my currently reading shelf because I haven't reviewed those yet. So one moment. Okay. Then we have Bride by Ali Hazelwood, which I also have a video for. So I'll leave that linked in the cards. I had a good time. I read this over the course of the month. I started off wanting to read this really right around the same time that I was reading Do Your Worst. I wanted it to be like a 1-2, and then it just got away from me, and I got onto the Bookopoly board, and Bookopoly kind of took over. So then Bride, like I said, that's linked up in the cards, but I had a really good time. I'm probably going to give that 4 stars. It's not a 5-star read just because the ending is a little bit too bonkers. And it's not that it's too bonkers. It's just I feel like it's abrupt. And so for a 400-page romance, the ending should not feel abrupt because you had plenty of time to land this plane, and Ali Hazelwood didn't do it. And then we got to Winter of the Worlds by Ken Follett. I love this book. I ate this book up, okay? This was my last Bookopoly spin. So on the last one, I got like a chance card, and what I had been doing instead of like actually picking chance cards was I was just rolling again, and I'd have to read a long book for the next prompt or pick 2 to satisfy the prompt. And so Winter of the World and the last book in the series, Edge of Eternity, were the last 2 Bookopoly prompts that I picked for whatever they were. I talk about it when I rolled and talk about it in the Patreon videos. So go over there if you want more specifics. But Winter of the World is the second book in the Century Trilogy. And I read Fall of Giants in June for the patrons for the daily vlogging. I don't think they voted on it, but I was just reading it, so I talked about it with them. And they got another Ken Follett moment here. But here is it's the run-up to World War II. So we deal with Spain and their fascist overtaking. We deal with World War II. So we are dealing with the Blitz. We're dealing with the invasion of Poland. We're seeing France, Belgium run over by the Nazis. We dabble in the Pacific. I feel like it's about as thorough a general overarching look at World War II as you can have in 900 pages when you are starting before the war, ending after the war. But what I've said on Instagram and what I stand by is that Ken Follett, for this series in particular, uses the world wars in the first 2 books and then the Cold War in the last book to really just play with the interpersonal connections between these people. And it's in Winter of the World where you really get to see everybody start to be connected in a way that they weren't necessarily in the first book. So in Fall of Giants, we're following, I think it's supposed to be 5 families. So we have some Russian brothers in still Tsarist Russia, so we get to see them overthrow the Tsar. We have a coal mining family in Wales. We have the Earl, also in Wales, that owns the mine that the Welsh family lives on. A German diplomat doing German diplomatic-y things, trying to avoid a world war situation. And then we have an American diplomat in the also in the mix in Fall of Giants. And so what we see in Winter of the World is all of these 5 families starting to come together and actually mingle in ways that you wouldn't have necessarily expected from before. Because in Fall of Giants, a couple of these families had interconnected, and they were they sort of knew one another. And by the time we get to Edge of Eternity, we see all 5 of these families deeply enmeshed in ways that are gag worthy. The drama is really what Ken lives for. And in Winter of the World, he really takes and utilizes World War II to new heights, and to really play with the emotions of the reader, to give the the reader like this backdrop of all this like horribleness that is happening in the world, to really clinch you into the reader. But it's also like not necessarily focused on battles. Like that was the other thing that I really appreciated about the World War One book, Fall of Giants, is even though the world is at war and that is very much present and you can't escape it in these books, it's not so much like I'm going to give you battle after battle after battle, but it's more of like how those things are impacting the characters themselves. Not every character in this book is a soldier on the battlefield, but we're still seeing how the battlefield is impacting these characters at home and what they are doing, particularly to kind of stand up to that. The only criticism that I had of Winter for the World was I felt that everybody in Germany that we were following kind of felt like they were a little bit too easy to join the resistance. And I felt like I wish I would have seen some more hesitancy, or, them to actually be nervous, like this could blow back on me, but I'm going to do it anyway. I wish that would have been a little bit more present. But other than that, like, again, an excellent book. Easily, I go back and forth because I really love Billy with Jesus. Billy with Jesus is like, I just love him because his name is fucking Billy with Jesus. Like that's his nickname. And I just love the Williams family overall. Fall of Giants is up there, but Winter of the World might be my second favorite of the series. And then I read The Woman in Me, Britney Spears. I have nothing negative to say about this. I do think that it's not the best memoir. Okay, like I think it's very important that we just, a fact is a fact is a fact. It's not the world's best memoir. It's not a bad memoir by any means. I just feel that what is good about it is Brittany having the ability to tell us in her own words the story that we already know. I think that if you are a fan of Brittany and you have followed the recent, flood of documentaries and news articles and, press releases about the situation, none of the information or very little of the information in this is new. And so to me, this isn't a memoir so much about going in to read it for the new information, although that is present. It really is just to have the opportunity to read more in her own words, her thoughts on the things that you already know. The other criticism of this book that I have is that I think that's a little bit too short, just because it really is just like chapter after chapter of things that we are kind of already aware of, with slight, I don't say slight, but also like addendums of like family stuff that I wouldn't know. Like, okay, I wouldn't have known that. So like there is new information in that regard. But then the other day, I think it was like on Deadline or something, they were reporting on one of her Instagram stories about her putting out a part 2. And to me, I feel like that's capitalism run amok, because this book is so fucking short, and it reads like a rebuttal to things that we already know, that for there to be a part 2 that is coming out at some other future date, allegedly conspiracy, that's unnecessary. It should have been included in this. This book is under 300 pages. So to me, it just feels a little cash grabby to split it up like that. But I'm gonna let Brittany do what Brittany wants to do. And will I read part 2 if there ever is a part 2? Yes, I will read it. I will be seated and present, and we'll talk about it. Then I read Edge of Eternity, which is the 3rd book in the Century Trilogy. This is the longest one. We're dealing with the Cold War. We're seeing how the families have they've all come together, but it's not like we're reading like, oh yeah, and then my cousin and I did they're still very distinct storylines that are following very distinct characters. Like these might be like they're definitely, we're following cousins. We're definitely following cousins, but some of these cousins is very realistic in the sense that like they have never seen one another, and not just because some of these people live behind the Iron Curtain at this point and some of these people don't live behind the Iron Curtain, but it's just like you might have relations in a foreign country that you are vaguely aware of, but like you're just never going to see them. And so this one, like I said, we're following the Cold War. So we start off in 1961, and the book ends on like the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then there's an epilogue that takes place on the inauguration of Barack Obama. So there's a lot of time that we have to cover here. And the first half of the book, up until I think I said in my Patreon videos, up until the Johnson administration. So once Lyndon B. Johnson leaves office and we get to the Nixon era, is a very distinct shift. So I feel like the early 60s up until the Johnson administration, which is really only 3 years, I mean, I guess it's a little bit longer, like post Kennedy assassination, but like that part of the book, like so much is happening, and it felt like we are dialed in and we are there, like we are locked and loaded. But after that, we get to the Ford, we get to the Nixon era, then the Ford era, and then the Jimmy Carter and the Reagan and the Bush, and that part of the book just flies by. And that's kind of like what happens in a lot of this series is like part of the book you are really locked and loaded, and then there are parts of the book that kind of fly by because we have to get through the entire 20th century. There isn't a lot of wiggle room here. And so parts of the story I do feel are underserved, and parts of it are maybe even overserved. But every character, when I tell you they have the messiest plot lines, these characters are connected in ways that I did not imagine them being connected. Real characters have relationship with these people that are just believable based on who they are, but it's still like I was gagged. We have abortions happening. We have characters in love with people they have no business being in affairs with. It's doing so much. Like this is also, I feel like, the bleakest of the series. And this is, a series where we had to watch people go to World War One. Like we were watching them, run through minefields. We were in, World War II. Thankfully, we avoided most of the concentration camps. Like we didn't have to like deal with anybody being in a concentration camp. But still, there was a scene at the end of Winter of the World where a character is gang raped. So like some dark shit has happened in this series, but I feel like there was always a hope and an optimism that was there. But in Edge of Eternity, I was just so sad for so much of the book. And then I also think the book goes on for a little bit too long. I think it goes like 100 pages past its best by date, but so it's not my favorite of the series by any means, but I still have a wonderful time, and I think that everyone should read the series. It's so good. It's so good. Is it almost like 3,000 pages? Yes. It's an insane length for a series to be for just some historical fiction, but please read it. Just please read. If you like characters, read them. I will say that you technically do not have to read all of them, because Ken Follett also does this excellent job of dropping all the information about the things that you would have read into the narrative in a way that I feel is organic. So even though I knew it, I still appreciated it, because I also think that if you read Fall of Giants in January and then you read Winter of the World, let's say in June, you will still know everything that you need to know about Fall of Giants, because he's going to remind you in 2 sentences. It's not like a lot of the book, but when you need to know something from a previous book that's happening now, he's going to give you 2 sentences. He's going to make it quick. He's going to make it snappy. It's going to flow. And so it's still very good, and I recommend it. And then the last book I read in the month of October was The List. This book is horrible. This book is not very good. Here we're following Ola and Michael. Ola is a journalist. Michael is not a journalist. Michael works kind of in the tech industry from what I remember. And they're supposed to get married. The book starts 30 days before their marriage. Michael is revealed to be a abuser, allegedly, on this Twitter list. It's like this Twitter list? No. It was a Google Doc that was tweeted out by an anonymous account that has a bunch of people on it in various industries. But Michael is on this list as someone who has an alleged restraining order, and he might have been physically abusive and might have harassed a former partner, a work person. It's not specific, but he might have, done that kind of a thing. And so now we have to read about Ola, not really sure that she wants to marry this man because she doesn't know what to believe. She wants to be a good feminist and be like, I believe the victims. I believe that if you're on this list, you're a bad person. But at the same time, you're my fiance. We're supposed to get married in a week. I don't know what I'm doing here. And so I just think that the direction this book goes in ultimately was offensive. There's really no getting around it. I think that it's just utter buffoonery, though the path that this book wants to go down, while simultaneously, it's pure buffoonery. It was the worst. Was it worse than Rouge? Maybe. It probably was worse than Rouge. But I really don't want to talk about this because I literally I read this and finished it yesterday, and so it was the last book that I vlogged for the patrons, and I still can't believe just how fucking stupid this book was. At no point was this book actively good on any imaginable level. It just... And partly because of just how it ends. The middle part of the book does so much lip service, kind of both sides of the argument, that it's silly. But then at the same time, like when we finally get to the end and we see the conclusion, we understand why Michael is on the list. That was the offensive part, because not only is the book is dual perspective. So like we're seeing Ola trying to get to the bottom of it. Then we see Michael and what Michael is hiding. And I feel like Michael's perspective really doesn't make you feel sympathetic to him, which I guess is important because he's on a list of abusers. But there are so many conversations this book just doesn't tackle, which is wild. But at the same time, it's like, okay, so I'm not sympathetic to you. Ola doesn't feel sympathetic to you either. And I also feel like the lengths that she was going to get to the bottom of things is just like, that's proof enough that you shouldn't marry this man. Like that's you just don't need to go through with this. But she it's silly. It's fucking silly. And so it's just so wild. And then when you get to the end of the book and you understand why this man was on the list, what he did or didn't do, it's just, it's too unserious for me personally. And it's not even that, it's just like in defense of people who may or may not be innocent or are suffering from false accusations. It's just that like none of that even matters by the time you get to chapter 27 and you read that chapter. Like the conversations that we could go back and forth in reviews and like whether or not books like this should exist are kind of null and void by the time we get to like what even happened in the story. So it's silly. Please don't read this book. Please don't support. I don't want to say like please don't support this book, even though I've already made an Instagram story saying please don't support this book. It's just the book is so deeply unserious that it's just not even worth your time. Like read literally anything else. You'll have a better time. And I regret having picked it up. I had wanted to read it so much. Like earlier in the month, I had picked it up alongside the Golden Gate. I did like a try a chapter tag because I was like, I wanted to read a mystery, kind of a thriller book. And I was like, oh, the Golden Gate pulled me in more. And then I gave it 2 stars. So I was like, all month I had been holding out hope, and I kept telling the patrons, I'm going to read this book and this book in the list. I'm going to read this book in the list. Like, but whatever like hell or high water, I was going to read the list last month. And then I read it and I was just like, God damn, like all month I had been saving this. I had been looking forward to it and it just did not connect. So that was my reading month. Let me know down below in the comments what your best and worst book of the month were. And I will see you guys again soon with another video. But until then, and until next time.